This video is going to discuss craft media and useful objects. For each of the different processes that we discuss, we're going to go over terms and techniques, discussing media like clay, glass, wood, metal, and textiles. We're going to start with learning about clay. So the process of using clay is just ceramics. It's a 1,000-year-old art and science, and someone who works predominantly in clay is called a ceramist, and someone who primarily makes dishes is called a potter. Most clay objects are going to need to go into a kiln, which is a high-temperature oven, which will harden and dry out the clay object. Usually, clay work is separated into 3 categories, and these are based on the temperature at which you fire. So, earthenware is fired at the lowest temperatures. It's from 8 to 1100 Celsius. It's porous after firing, which means that it's not food safe, and it's usually a red, brown, or tan color. It's the most common for the world's pots. Then we have stoneware, which is fired at a higher temperature, which is like 12 to 1300 Celsius. It's heavier, it's usually like a gray and brown color. It's what most of today's potters use. It's strong and easily workable, and when you fire it, it's non-porous, which means it is food safe. You have to fire things really hot or with certain glazes for them to be safe to eat off of. Porcelain is fired at an even higher temperature, like 13 to 1400 Celsius. It's the rarest and most expensive, made from granite deposits. It's white and non-porous after firing, and it was first perfected in China. And you can see an example here. While there's different techniques with firing, there's also different techniques for making. So hand building is just what it sounds like. The ceramist will create forms with their hands. They won't be using a wheel. They'll bond together the pieces by scoring them, which is where you just draw lines or rough up the edges, and then you put them together with slip in the middle. Slip is a mixture of water and clay that works almost like a glue, and it gets in those cracks that you've made and helps bond the pieces together. There's also throwing. Now with throwing, you can use a kick wheel, which you're literally kicking the bottom plate to make the top of it spin. Or what most people use more recently is you can use an electronic wheel, and you just control the speed with a foot pedal. There's also casting, which is where you sculpt an object and then you form a mold around it so that you can make multiples out of that mold. And actually, most of the processes we're going to talk about today can make copies from a mold. So clay also comes in different stages. So when it's wet and malleable and you can throw it on the wheel or hand build with it, this is called plastic or wet clay. So once you let it dry a little bit without being totally dry, it becomes leather hard. And leather hard you can trim, but you can't really change the shape anymore. Bone dry is when the clay is totally dried out, at which point it can go into the bisque kiln. After your object has been bisqued, it looks kind of chalky, but now it's ready for you to put the glaze on it. Glaze is what you usually see as the pretty shiny outside color, although it often changes greatly from when you first paint it because of the chemical reactions that happen when it's inside of the kiln. You can see in this photo you have a bone dry, a bisque fired, and a glazed mug. These are just a couple contemporary examples of ceramics today. Both of them are using traditional techniques in a more contemporary way. Again, here we have contemporary concepts using traditional tools. Although this example is a little different because the previous two, they were using traditional techniques in a traditional form, whereas this is a non-traditional form. This person has created porcelain weapons, which have no function outside of being an art object. This artist takes it a step further by giving the illusion of using wood while still using ceramics. Next we have glass, which itself is a 3,000-year-old medium used for containers, decoration, windows, jewelry, etc. Usually it's manipulated in its molten amorphous form, and then once it is cooled, it can be etched, cut, fused, laminated, painted, polished, and so much more. Because heat is a vital part of the process, using glass requires speed and accuracy because the glass will lose its shape if it's too hot, and it'll crack if it's cooled too quickly. So some of the processes in glass are casting and stained glass. Like ceramics, in casting you take a mold and you put your medium inside of it and you can create multiples. Where ceramics relied on being wet and then drying into the shape, glass is going to be hot and then cooling into its shape and hardening. Stained glass is a similar process where glass is formed into shapes by molds and then it's embedded in thin pipes of lead. To get the colored glass, like you see in this example, glass can be mixed in with color or it can be glazed and painted afterward. During the Middle Ages, European religious buildings utilized stained glass windows, which is really where stained glass as a craft peaked. Other means of creating glass are hot sculpting, which is where you have the molten glass on the end of a rod and you use special tools to manipulate it, like pulling and pushing certain parts. For glass blowing, you're going to gather your molten glass onto a blowpipe and blow air into the form from the opposite end, creating a bubble-like form and then placing it into an annealing oven to slowly cool down. Unlike both of those techniques, lamp working does not use a furnace. It uses a lamp or a torch, and then again you have those special tools to manipulate the glass. Here we have some contemporary examples for glass. This is the Chihuly Glass House in Seattle. You can see the installation of a bunch of glass pieces in the top of the ceiling, but also if you look out the window, you can see another installation that's in the garden outside. These are two more Chihuly pieces. The left one is just outside of those windows in the glass house in the garden. The piece on the right is on the interior of that building. It has lights throughout the glass pieces, and it's sitting on a black reflective surface, which gives us those really cool reflections in the bottom. Like one of our ceramics examples, this is another instance of weapons being used as subject matter, as juxtaposed to their really fragile medium. Now we're going to talk about wood. A lot of wood artists like to maintain that textured look of the wood grain, and a lot of times wood is a really sustainable material, and some woodworkers go so far as to use trees that have already fallen down, or they harvest from certified forests. Depending on the aesthetic that the artist is going for, the wood can be left in its natural form, or it can be stained or painted. Wood also comes in different textures, hardness, and color, depending on the type of tree it was from. Now, artists that utilize these differences participate in marquetry, where the artist is utilizing these visual differences to create a certain design. This was used in ancient Egypt and also in 18th century Northern Europe. Marquetry can be very ornate, which we see in this example, which uses 30,000 pieces of wood. Other ways to manipulate wood include bending it around a jig, which is a device that holds it into place. Wood becomes easier to bend when it's been steamed or soaked in water. Or you could glue thin pieces of wood together, which is called laminating, and then bend them around this jig to dry into that shape. There's also kerf cutting, which is where you cut notches into the back of the piece so it folds like an accordion and creates a curved shape, and then you glue it into place. Here's our examples for contemporary wood artists. In these works, the artist is comparing a traditional medium with the digital age. We also expect to see pixels in two-dimensional spaces, but this artist has created a sculpture and put the pixels into the same three-dimensional space with us. Next we have this triptych by David Nash, which again is comparing two-dimensional with three-dimensional space. Next, we're going to talk about metal. Metal can be cast, hammered, cut, inlaid, drawn out, welded, or joined with rivets. Like glass, metal can be very malleable at high temperatures, yet when it hardens, it's very durable and strong. Which is why we often see it in statues, because it can stand the test of time. However, early metalsmiths created coins, tools, vessels, armors, and weapons. Some pretty simple techniques for manipulating metal are punching, which is where you push a hole through it using a drill, or stamping, which is pushing a portion of the metal up or down, not pushing it all the way through like in punching, and you create something similar to an embossing. Then there's welding, which is where you adhere two pieces of metal together using heat to create the joint. Like some of the other materials we've discussed, metal can also be cast, and a common method throughout history is the lost wax method. During this method, there's a wax coating poured into the mold, followed by a clay core. Then the wax is melted and drained out, and the remaining space is filled with bronze, producing a hollow sculpture when the core is discarded. Another method is called inlaying, where small pieces are fit into carved recesses. Historically, this was perfected in Muslim regions of the Middle East, and the example to the right was first cast in bronze before silver pieces were cut and placed into the design cavities. Oftentimes, silver, gold, and copper are inlaid into brass, bronze, and steel. These are our contemporary examples for metalworking. And as we stated, metal is really durable and strong, so this is an outdoor installation. This is actually installed, as you see it, upside down on a wall, and it's Kiki Smith's Lilith. As you can see here, a very hard, stiff material like metal can be combined with very fragile materials like the glass eyes. I also included Yinka Shonobare's material series, which is a great example of how fluid metal can look. as well as showing the effects you can achieve by painting it. The next material we're going to talk about is textiles. One method of which is weaving, and weaving is an ancient process of interlacing fibers, with the earliest artifact dating back to 7000 BCE, and it was found in south-central Turkey. Woven items are created on a loom or a machine that holds the fibers into place. It lifts and separates layers based on foot pedals. To successfully create a design, it's often required that the weaver envision the whole design before even starting. Tapestries are woven wall hangings, and throughout history they've been valued as much as paintings, especially in decorating across Europe. Many times, textiles use stitching, which is looping thread through a fabric using a needle. Embroidery is stitching decorative thread into and over this base of woven fabric, the oldest evidence of which is from 4th century BCE, but it may be as old as weaving itself, we just haven't found evidence of this yet. However, it was very prevalent in Peru, especially in the Paracas Peninsula, where researchers of the 1930s found evidence like this funerary cape. Carpet weaving is another prevalent form of textiles throughout history. We see it really prevalent in 16th century Islamic Persia, and in the Safavid dynasty they created these elaborate designs off the loom. The example we see here has 300 knots over fine silk threads per square inch, requiring approximately 25 million knots in total. Quilt making is another textile technique, during which you stitch together 3 or more pieces of fabric, either manually or with a sewing machine. Yet another technique is knitting, which is where yarn is manipulated to create a fabric, garment, or object. These are our contemporary textile examples. Here we see Judy Chicago's The International Honors Quilt, which was started by her but really has many, many collaborators. And it is actually housed at the University of Louisville. Ebony G. Patterson uses a lot of different materials, but these are some examples in which she's used textiles and fibers. We can see in these examples that she's using fabric and different embroidery techniques. This is another one of her works, and it's using a lot of different kinds of fabrics, but it's in a 3-dimensional space. Fiber arts don't just have to be a flat piece of cloth. So now we're on to our usual so what? Why do we care? A big conversation around craft is where is the line between craft and art? It's really blurry. If we look at our pottery pieces, are those crafts because they're functional, or are they art because they serve a conceptual meaning? Is art functional, or is that a distinction? Is art only meant to be consumed as entertaining or thought-provoking? What happens when you can use art? Another thing to think about is the amount of time and labor required for all of these different processes. How does that time and ritualized sense of making affect the object once it's made? Also, think about the different qualities of these materials. How did they affect the final work? For instance, we saw weapons made out of very fragile objects. In that way, the materiality of the medium was what gave it meaning. I also want to leave you with this triptych of Ai Weiwei dropping a Han Dynasty Urn. So using what we learned about the craft processes, respond to this photo triptych, which is one artwork in 3 panels, in which Ai Weiwei drops a Han Dynasty urn. The artist claims to have done so to critique the lack of respect and concern for ancient objects in his contemporary culture. Using his big name and the shock value of these photos, he was able to bring the issue to light while giving this urn itself a new life. He immortalized it in the performance and the photos. Ai Weiwei saw this as a collaboration between the past and the present, both inspired by and in reverence of this ancient past, as a creation of new, not a destruction of the old. Did he accomplish his goal? Is the art the act of dropping the urn? Or is it the photographs used to capture this action? Is this a fresh collaboration or just a shock factor destruction? How does the time and labor of ceramics affect this work conceptually? How would it be different if the medium or process were different? Feel free to hate this work, feel free to not like it but understand it, and feel free to love it. I look forward to hearing you guys' responses. Stay safe and make sure you get some sleep.